One thing to say is that it is really quite important to look on the ground because it's at the level of detail that we were able to figure out what are the losses, what are the gains, how does the arrival of a plantation corporation affect different segments of the population, different ethnic groups, genders, old and young people. Basically, there's a whole series of kind of losses and gains connected with the arrival of these plantations, and figuring that out actually requires, quite a close-up lens. So it's hard to say in aggregate, are the people doing well? Well, some people, yes, and some people absolutely not, right? But who has lost, who has gained, and more importantly, like what have been the mechanisms? Through what mechanisms have people either lost or gained from the arrival of these plantations is something which requires a pretty fine-grained analysis in order to discern it. So the one thing is that there are both losses and gains. I think, doing the head count is important. This argument that plantations, reduce poverty, the head count is important, for how many people, but also for which people and through what mechanisms. And I would say also really important to think about over what period of time. In one of the papers that I've written about this on kind of intergenerational displacement, I argued that the effects that one might see in the course of one generation, let us say that the first plantation that arrives, there's still plenty of land around. And for those people, the arrival of a plantation may not mean catastrophic losses if they still have plenty of farmland. And it may even involve some gains because there's new infrastructure, maybe there's a road, now they have access to a mill, right? So for that generation, it may look like a plus. But then fast forward 30 years and one plantation was followed by 5 more plantations because as the frontier, the plantation frontier fills in with more and more. So now those folks don't have any access to land. Their own land frontier is closed. And here they are squeezed into little nooks and crannies between plantations. It looks completely different now than it did a generation ago. Now what you see is all loss and no gain. You also see the complete foreclosure of alternative futures. Right? Now with no land, you have no option to farm for yourself, whether of the plantation crop, whether it's oil palm or sugar or rubber, whatever it is, you can't get into that business, nor can you retain food or other kinds of farming that you were doing before. So the question of, development and poverty reduction has to be seen also in a kind of intergenerational trajectory, I would say. We also found that this is true even from a labor point of view. That's to say that when a plantation is working in an isolated way on a new frontier, it may have to pay fairly good wages and offer good conditions in order to attract and hold workers because there's plenty of land about. So the locals probably don't want to do this work unless it's well paid. If you bring in migrants, well, you're going to have to pay them pretty well to hold them, or they too will just go join the villagers and start farming, right? If there's lots of land and it's abundant. So there is a time period in which labor may also do quite well. But then over time, when the land fills in with plantations and the number of people needing work increases, you've basically created a proximate labor reserve, of people who now have no land and are desperately in need of work. And that's the period at which the plantations find they can afford to casualize their labor regime. They no longer need to offer good and permanent jobs in good conditions because there's tons of people all around in desperate need of work. So they create their own labor reserve over a period of time. So I think that's the kind of temporal framework in which you have to look at this question of, development and poverty reduction. Not just in the immediate drama of, eviction and enclosure, but looking at the temporal sequence. I think would also be something that's really worth paying attention to. In the questions of, in terms of the type of development they install, I've just given a talk about that. But one of the characteristics is that you are installing inevitably a David and Goliath kind of relationship in which a corporation arrives backed by formidable government power, because corporations are there at the behest, with the blessing and the permission of government. So you've brought in an actor which is massively supported and empowered, vis-a-vis a local population whose land rights may be insecure or rendered insecure, and whose capacity to protect their own interests and advocate on their own behalf, or as we have shown, their capacity to go to local officials to advocate for them, is radically undermined by the arrival of a plantation. So that's a whole political dynamic, which I think is very much under-researched really in the literature on kind of land grabbing, right? It's like, what will be the future set of relations between these people and this corporation and the government? In that triangle, what will be the alignments, and what will be the, the capacities of the people who stand to lose here to actually defend their interests? Interesting. So, on the one hand, I think Henry and I have been kind of on the same page in the sense of, attending to the problem of the relative surplus population, right? In Marxist terms, people who have no value to capital, who are not required as workers, and who are present in such excessive numbers that they don't even play the classic role of a labor reserve in terms of depressing wages. It's like you need a surplus to depress wages, but you don't need a surplus to the surplus, right? I mean, there's just more than enough people to already have wages very low. So I think so. This question of the fate of people who are not absorbed as workers is a huge one, and is something that we should pay attention to. But I don't think it's the only agrarian question. There is also, an agrarian question of access to agricultural futures and productive activities. So in the case of oil palm, what farmers say is that what they need, they say, is 6 hectares. 2 hectares of oil palm feeds the family. 2 hectares feeds the farm, covers the production costs, the fertilizers and the, labor costs, etc. And 2 hectares generates the fund to send their children to university, or to buy land for their children so that they too can inherit, land and have this reproduce this kind of farming pattern. So they have a sense that a small scale 6 hectares of productive oil palm is a very good life, and enables them to meet their aspirations to educate their children and to build up their class position and to sustain it across the generations. Any less than that, and our study shows this quite clearly, is actually a recipe for impoverishment. Because if you have only 2 hectares, you cannot both feed the family and the farm, and are likely to enter a downward spiral of debt and eventual land loss. So a bit like the story I told in Land's End, getting into a lucrative crop in the context of a boom is very attractive to farmers. They do face risks, risks if they don't manage to build up a farm of a sufficient scale, and also, risks of you know, if they're tied into monopsonistic contracting arrangements, or, you know, unable to gain the proper value of their crop because of excessive debt and, you know, extortionate credit, etc. All really of the factors that I described in Land's End are in play also among oil palm smallholders. So what can be done about this? What is the agrarian question, the policy question, is does a government want to support a vibrant and prosperous smallholder sector and enable a lot of farmers to get into a lucrative crop, ideally while also holding other options open, you know, not to be entirely committed to oil palm, but perhaps to have a few different crops on the go. You know, mixed farming has so many benefits. Or will there be no such support? So what's happening now is that all of the government policy heavily favors corporate occupation, and that squeezes smallholders onto small areas of land. Nevertheless, many people are trying to get into the crop, and the people who do so most successfully are usually people with capital. So it's government officials, plantation managers, school teachers, you know, people who have steady incomes, who can borrow, who have access to credit. Those are the people who are successfully establishing, and some local farmers as well. Many more people could get into it successfully if there was more support. So, you know, access to the infrastructure, credit programs which are fair, access to the planting material, high quality seedlings, you know, a policy to support smallholders in the context of a crop boom can mitigate some of the risk and enable more people to prosper from this crop than is now the case. It does follow on from what I said. You know, I would say that Indonesian farmers have been eager participants in global crop production since the 1700s. You know, when coffee was first introduced into Indonesia around 1700, farmers adopted it eagerly and were planting it until the Dutch imposed a monopoly and drove the price down to nothing, you know, coerced production, didn't pay people the market value, and they burnt their coffee bushes in disgust, right? I mean, given fair access, Indonesian farmers have shown for a long time that they are eager to participate in markets for all kinds of crops, including global market crops. So there is no problem of a kind of, you know, indigenous aversion to cash cropping, right? But the question is the conditions under which people do this: fair access, government support, infrastructure, and so on. So given that people are eager to do this, will there always be a story of differentiation, like the story that I told in Land's End? Probably yes, definitely with oil palm. I would argue that this differentiation, again, has to be seen, and this has become clearer to me working in the plantation context, which I hadn't done when I was working on Land's End. You know, on a scale of 1 to 10, the monopoly of the corporations is so much greater than, you know, even the biggest of the local smallholders. You know, what we found was that the most successful of the local indigenous smallholders growing oil palm successfully is they maxed out at about 20 hectares. You know, beyond that, they couldn't manage it. Then they had to hire managers, and they became kind of like plantations. They lost control of their enterprise. You know, issues of theft and supervision, you know, entered. Basically, the smallholder advantage of close supervision by the owner, which ensures, you know, high yields and, you know, managed costs, etc., topped out at around 20 hectares. So you could say there's a kind of a natural ceiling for the smallholder model. And these guys who got up to 20 hectares, you know, were exhausted managing their farms, but they also were intending to give them to their children, you know, 2 or 3 children, it would reduce, right? So there's a kind of there is an accumulation, but it's within bounds, and it's very different from installing a plantation with 10 or 20 or 30,000 hectares, you know, and employing a few workers. So differentiation, yes. Is that, you know, the worst thing that can happen in the oil palm context? No, there's something else far worse, and that's corporate monopoly, right? Which just cuts all the people out. Another thing we found is that the smallholders paid their workers double what the plantations did. They had to compete for workers. And not actually in this Kalimantan site, but in a Sulawesi plantation that I studied with my old comrade Antu Sungaji some years ago, before I started on the Kalimantan work, we found that workers were being paid really quite well, and the profit we found was pretty much equally split between the landowner and the workers. You know, if you look at the monthly revenue, about half of it was being spent on labor, and the other half was being retained by the owner of the oil palm smallholding. So that's a good outcome, right? In the sense that, you know, workers also do well, especially if there's a bit of a labor shortage or skilled labor is in short supply. So there are contexts in which even differentiation into owners and non-owners is not catastrophic. You know, it can still lead to a fairly healthy and vibrant kind of local development. And, you know, folks who don't have land, if enough money is circulating locally, they start other businesses, you know, food businesses and hair salons, and, you know, all kinds of off-farm small enterprises thrive when people have money. You know, people have money to spend, and then they're fixing up their houses, and, you know, you start a little workshop fixing up motorbikes. I mean, you know, you install TV antenna. Lots of small enterprises grow up when people are prospering. So plantations, though, don't do that because the locals do not prosper, right? The money is extracted. It goes to the corporate owners, and it goes to workers who remit. You know, if they're migrant workers, they remit to somewhere else, right? They're not actually investing in or spending their money locally. So a plantation, you know, the Caribbean sociologist George Beckford, you know, realizes looking at Caribbean sugar enterprises that plantations produce kind of dead zones. They don't produce lively development because the money isn't circulating locally. It doesn't produce a multiplier. So, you know, there are lots of reasons to kind of worry about class differentiation about smallholders, but I think in a larger context, it's not necessarily a catastrophe, right? You know, you have to sort of see the whole picture to make sense of that. So I think that, you know, local capitalist farmers in Indonesia, you know, they'll do fine, but right now the opportunities are being, you know, severely captured, you know, both by corporations and by folks with capital who can kind of, you know, gobble up land and become effectively small plantations, while folks who'd like to get into this are just being squeezed out.